so much. As a child, I loved Easter. You know, getting up in the morning, the first thing that we did was always an Easter egg hunt, treasure hunting. Doesn't everybody love that? Getting to find the eggs, opening them up, getting to eat the jelly beans and the chocolate was certainly exciting, but I also realized that there was some kind of spiritual significance going on with the Easter holiday. And as a child, I was trying to figure it out because there were these strange stories about this guy being killed, and then people were actually celebrating. So kind of what's with that? It can be confusing as a child, right? So I want to start today with a bit of a history lesson. Bible scholars and historians are really pointing to the fact that Easter began way before in the life of Jesus, and that it was actually a Saxon pagan festival. And this is Istra. If you Google online, you'll find out her name is spelled in many different ways, but she was the goddess of spring. And she's also very often shown in pictures with bunny rabbits and eggs, all a sign of prosperity, fertility specifically, and also new life, the chicks that come out of the eggs, new life. So there's the connection between the bunny and the eggs and Istra. So where does that get to Jesus? Well, with the celebration of spring, there's a change of seasons. It's a life cycle from spring, summer, winter, and fall. Well, to get to Jesus, there's also sort of the same kind of process with his life. So with Jesus, you know, we know that he was born. We celebrate with Christmas. He had a physical birth. And then around this time of year, we recognize the fact that there was a crucifixion and then a resurrection. Well, there was also that process of life and cycle of life that he lived, and it's also a lesson for each of us to learn. I also like to look at the word resurrection as rebirth. So, and in Unity, we like to focus on the metaphysics of things, so we'll be talking a lot about that today. You know, he had a physical life, but we also like to interpret that journey metaphysically. So it's not surprising to me that there was actually this merging of these two different ideas about the cycle of life with Jesus and the cycle of life with the goddess of spring, because this is all about creating new life. This is a story about our unconsciousness and how we can actually become new again at any moment in time. You know, in Unity, I really think that every single day is an Easter day. It's a celebration of life, and it's actually a celebration of higher consciousness. Now, I know that last week Reverend Paul Hasselbeck was here. I love him. He has done some fabulous work with bringing metaphysics back into Sunday services. You know, this is really the root of Unity Christianity, is metaphysics. And so I brought his map back, and I want to continue on from what he started. If you weren't here, that's fine. You can jump right in. I want you to be aware that we're starting over on this side of the map, and we're moving this way. There's locations at the top, and then underneath there are metaphysical interpretations. Now, it's going to take a little bit of thinking today for you to follow along with me, but I promise at the end I'm going to bring it all together, and you're going to understand that this is not as complicated as you might think. Okay? Okay? So Bethany, and this, we're talking about Holy Week and Jesus' journey before the crucifixion and resurrection. Some of this journey begins in the Bible in Bethany, which is about an ability to overcome in our own life. That's what it signifies. The next part is high principle, and that is Mount of Olives or Olivet. And then the next one is the temple, which is about spiritual illumination. And then the next one is about Jerusalem, and that's a place of peace. I also want you to notice the key at the bottom, and that it says like 1 mile. Well, we're guessing that journey on foot during that time would have been, maybe 2 to 3 miles, something like that. It wasn't specifically short, especially if you're walking. But more importantly, when we're in the place of Bethany in our consciousness, because that's what we're talking about today is our consciousness, we're in a place of our head, we're in our thinking mind. But if we're way over in Jerusalem, we're in a place of peace, which actually resonates in our heart. So that's an important note as I continue forward. So let's move on to, so here's our metaphysical interpretations that I presented. Bethany, a place to overcome. Now in the Bible, what I did is I actually found like a day-by-day account of what happened in the week up to before his crucifixion and resurrection, and I want to go through those and pick out key words that I'm going to give you the metaphysical interpretation to. So on Saturday, just before Palm Sunday, And I'm repeating just a little bit of what Reverend Paul Hasselbeck shared last week so that everybody's on board with where we're going. Jesus drew near to Jerusalem, arriving at Bethany 6 days before Passover. He was anointed at Simon the leper's house, and that's actually in the Gospel book of Matthew. Bethany is, again, that place to overcome. And then Simon the leper's house represents a state of body consciousness, which is vital substance has been, the word is vitiated, or made defective. So there's something going on in our body, and specifically our mind, that is defective, and we need to overcome it. Also at that time, he was anointed by a woman that was in the house, and that is, metaphysically, men are more often more about thoughts. Women are more often about feelings. So it's interesting that a woman was anointing Jesus, and perhaps the reference is that he needed to get into his feelings, and that is an affirmation of peace and poise and gladness. You'll also notice that on the overhead I have a lot of the references to the RW and MBD, and these are these resources that we have in Unity that are just really a treasure trove. This is the research and work of Charles Fillmore, and it's been all put together for us to review if we would like, and we don't have to. We can actually read the Bible and come up with our own interpretations of things. Some people are glad to hear that, but this is a valuable resource, and I love it. This big book is the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, and it has mostly people and places listed in it. And then this other book is The Revealing Word, which is much shorter, and it's mostly just about like things and animals. And I'll leave them up here if you would like to look at those after the service. So let's move on. So Palm Sunday, there was a great crowd that came to see Jesus approaching Jerusalem. He rode a donkey through the streets and was celebrated with palm leaves being waved and placed at his feet. And the symbol is, the words that I picked out of there were the donkey, which is absolutely a symbol of peace. If he'd been riding a war horse, they might have been in trouble. But no, it was a donkey. He was being very peaceful. And there was the palm leaves were a symbol of victory, actually a hero's welcome for Jesus coming into this space, and challenging really what was going on in the culture at that time. So back to our map. On Monday, Jesus entered Jerusalem, visited the temple, and then returned to Bethany again. So there's this pattern of being in Bethany and then going into Jerusalem. On Tuesday, on the way from Bethany to Jerusalem, Jesus cursed the fig tree, and in Jerusalem challenged the temple practice of selling on the premises. So here we have the fig tree, which is a symbol of fruit and prosperity, and yet he's cursing it. You might wonder why that is. He's not happy with how things are going on, apparently. And then the selling of merchandise at the temple is about materialism present in a high spiritual place, which he thought was very inappropriate. It was a spiritual place. We shouldn't be selling goods there. That same day, some religious leaders began to plot ways to kill him. And meanwhile, Jesus left Jerusalem again, and it is assumed that he returned to Bethany. So back to my map again. So Jesus has gone back and forth several different times, and metaphysically we can say he was going back and forth between his head and his heart several different times as he's trying to figure out a way to shift his own consciousness to a spiritual place. Which place do you think that he preferred to reside? Bethany or Jerusalem? It would be Jerusalem, and I think that's true for each of us in our own journeys in life. How often do we do this in our own lives? As we're trying to do our own work and to shift our own consciousness to something higher, we end up in this place of going back and forth while we figure out what it is and then truly claim that spiritual place. And this is the metaphysical interpretation that Reverend Paul gave last week. I did want to bring it back into the service. He said, in order to raise myself to a higher peaceful state of consciousness, I must put together all my resources, principle, powers, associated thoughts, and feelings while controlling my sense consciousness. Even so, chemicalization occurs. Now, chemicalization is an important term in Unity, and it's very unique to Unity. And I'll explain it this way. Looking at our glasses of water, over on one side is the empty glass, and way over on the other side is the very full glass. So if we're looking at an issue of prosperity in our lives, you may be wanting to make that shift from the limited thinking to the unlimited thinking, the full glass. So can you see how those two extremes might create some kind of internal agitation within yourself as you try to get to that higher thinking? It's the same thing. We go back and forth. What do I really believe? And we continue to affirm our infinite prosperity. So that chemicalization term is incredibly important. And we can actually look at what is actually going on inside us when we're doing this. I pulled out the book Lessons in Truth from Emily Cady, and she explains it like this. She says, we're in that place of chemicalization. There has been a clash between the old condition, which was based on falsehood, fear, and wrong ways of thinking, and the new thought or truth entering into you. The old mortal is kicking vigorously against the truth, just like a little kid. You have a feeling of discouragement or of fear. She says, do not be frightened. That which you feel is on the spiritual plane a similar excitement and agitation to that which was seen in the chemical action between the alkali and acid on the material plane. And she says be patient, because as we keep doing this work, something higher and better always results. So, this is like us just taking like a big soda bottle, a plastic bottle, and emptying it halfway, and then shaking it up, and we can see all the bubble fizz, it's like it's going to explode. That's the chemicalization that's actually within us as we're working to make that shift to a higher place of consciousness. And it's important to recognize this in unity, because a lot of times people think they're actually doing their work, and they say, wait a minute, I feel like crap. Something's not going right, okay? We have to affirm that this is part of our process, and we'll get it. It's a human journey. We will get it. Also, of interesting note, in Lessons in Truth, the book by Emily Cady, there's been several different publications over the years. And during one section of time, they actually took out the term chemicalization. There was this feeling it might be too negative and that people might not want to go to that place. And yet, as we have spiritually matured in our own ways, we figured out they've got it right. We need to look at this. And so they brought it back into publication. If you ever are reading Lessons in Truth for the first time, make sure you get a copy that has the term chemicalization in it. So let's move back again to our map. On Wednesday, on the way to Jerusalem, the disciples saw the withered fig tree. At the temple in Jerusalem, Jesus' authority and wisdom was questioned by some of the religious leaders. That afternoon, Jesus went to Mount of Olives and delivered his discourse to those who assembled. Jesus then predicts that he will be crucified at the time of the Passover. And this is the time when Judas shows up. Judas planned the betrayal of Jesus with some religious leaders. So I picked out just a couple terms here. Interesting to note that the withered fig tree is really about a lack of prosperity. And it can also symbolize dryness and perhaps as a foreshadowing of death. And then Judas, even in this picture, he looks kind of shifty-eyed. He's actually one of the disciples and one of the 12 powers and is a part of us. Some people think he represents the shadow side of ourselves. In this particular situation, we're looking at him as an example of sense consciousness when we're really focusing on what we can see in the world and can't get to that spiritual place. It's about coveting and incarnated selfishness, and his every thought is to build up personality. When I first read this, I thought a little bit about what's going on in our political world today, but then I decided, okay, I won't go there. Yeah, don't go there. The Metaphysical Bible Dictionary continues on about Judas saying, sense consciousness betrays man every day, yet it would be unwise wholly to destroy it before its time, because at its foundation it is good. It has simply gone wrong. It is our ego in control, and we need to find the path to the good part of our ego, so then we can move on to a place of spiritual consciousness. So let's continue. On Thursday, Jesus and his disciples prepared the Passover lamb, and they had their meal together. So I like a lamb as a sign of innocence, and I think that we're in this place of trying to change our thoughts and to come to something higher, new, and spiritual principle. Then the lamb is representing that. We are in a place of innocence. Let's not beat ourselves up, just realize that we want to do something different and make it okay. Now, Passover is outwardly that Jewish feast that we're aware of. It's celebrating the exodus of the Jews from slavery in Egypt. And yet symbolically, it's a mental attitude where we are bridging over from an old state of consciousness and entering that new state of consciousness, from mortal to spiritual consciousness. Jesus shared helpful words that day with his disciples, and he offered an intercessory prayer on their behalf. They arrived at the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus suffered in agony while waiting what was to become. And here's the garden. You can see barely, the Garden of Gethsemane is kind of right over to the left of Olivet, noticing that it's very close to the temple, very close to a place of high spirituality. And we can envision a forest of olive trees that's what they made olive oil out of, a place of great prosperity and spirituality. And here's the metaphysical interpretation. The struggle that takes place within the consciousness when truth is realized as the one reality. All the good is pressed out and saved, and the error is denied away. This is often agony, the suffering that the soul undergoes in giving up its cherished idols or in letting go of human consciousness. If you've ever been on your knees in pain over something in your life, you may have actually been sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane. So later that night, Jesus was betrayed and arrested. He was tried by numerous religious leaders. Here are some of the names. Again, these are people of high spiritual scholars, but yet they're all in their head and not in their heart, and they have no concept of the inner mind of spirit. Friday, early in the morning, Jesus was tried by the Sanhedrin, which is the council, and Pilate and Herod, and Pilate yet again. So here are some of the metaphysical terms of these people. Pilate is carnal will and sense consciousness, and Herod is the ego and sense consciousness. So Jesus was then led to the cross, and it was said he wore a crown of thorns. So these terms, the cross, a state of consciousness, was just about the mortal mind. And that crown lifts it up, though. It says that which imparts honor or splendor, recognizing the consciousness of Jesus. The crown of eternal life is the prize to all who overcome sense consciousness or carnal mind. So Jesus was actually crucified and died several hours later. Here's a metaphysical interpretation of that crucifixion. This is the surrender or death of the whole personality in order that the Christ mind may be expressed in its fullness. Saturday, Jesus' body was in the tomb during the Sabbath, and the Pharisees hired Roman guards to keep watch at the tomb. So we can look at the metaphysical interpretation of tomb, which is an elevated, peaceful state of consciousness. I also like what Charles Fillmore wrote about this in The Revealing Word. He continued on and said, "For us, the tomb represents a high state of consciousness in us in which we improve in our character along all lines. We do not only grow into a broader understanding, but also we increase in vitality and substance. We are resting in God, and at the same time gathering strength for the power of greater demonstrations to follow. In this state of consciousness, the word of truth is not idle, but quietly spreading. This process continues until the whole consciousness is vitalized by the Holy Spirit." Interesting to note that he was waiting outside the tomb during these times, but the hired guards that were hired by the Pharisees, and again, they're all in their head, not in their heart, in a place of spirit. So they were outside the tomb. Sunday, Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Metaphysically, the resurrection takes place in us every time we rise to Jesus' realization of the perpetual indwelling life that is connecting us with the Father. Physical death is not necessary. And I love this quote from 1 Corinthians, "We will not all die, but we all will be changed." That is the journey of our life in unity. We're striving to change our thinking mind so we can live from a place of spirituality. In the book, The 12 Powers of Man, Charles Fillmore refers to the power of the Christ mind. He says, "It is a gradual change that brings about a complete transformation of the body through the renewal of the mind." Now again, in Lessons in Truth, Emily Cady explains it this way. Actually, I want to show something else first. She picks out two words that define this. One is personality, and one is individuality. And personality is more like our ego. And individuality is our Christ nature. That's the God part of ourselves. That's why I capitalized it. And when we're born, all of our energy, noticed, is over on that side. But then she explains, do not confound the terms. One may have an aggressive, pronounced personality or external man or woman, which will for a time fight its way through obstacles and gain its point. But a pronounced individuality never battles. It is never puffed up. It is never governed by likes and dislikes, and never causes them in others. It is God come forth in greater degree through man, and all mere personality instinctively bends the knee before it in recognition of its spiritual superiority. So, and I would suggest that with each bend of that knee, we each go through our own death in consciousness. Now, remember, it's not a literal death, folks. It's a death to our personality, our ego. I do remember one of my first ego deaths. Coming out of college, I was a television news reporter and producer and weekend anchor, and I loved that job, and yet after a few years, I recognized that's not what I wanted to continue to do. And so I wanted to be a writer-producer more behind the scenes in the business world, and I moved into that avenue. And yet, it was what I wanted to do, but I had to leave behind this television personality that I had created, and it was a bit of a death. It was quite an adjustment, and yet I knew it was still true to who I wanted to be. And it kind of moved me along the way. I can't see that this is exact of where I was, but it moved me. It shifted me into another place. Another example, they're not all negative, by the way. They can be very subtle. Another example of this is the birth of my first child. I had my first child at age 36, so I'd been on my own for quite a while. And I certainly wanted him, but there was this aspect of me letting go of my freedom and owning that I had to care for this other being that was more important than anything else in the world. It was not all about me. It was about him and, my family. So again, I can't say again this is exact, but you get the idea. You move your consciousness. And then ultimately, we want to end up way over here, which is really what the role model of what Jesus was. He was showing us the way. This is how you want to act. This is how you want to behave. And this is how you want to have a spiritual life. Now, I've been sharing a lot of metaphysical interpretation today. But now you may want to understand why, for Easter services are really interesting for ministers, for Unity ministers, because really Easter is not just one day of the year. This is a celebration of life and a celebration of life practice that we absolutely do every day in Unity. This is the norm, not the exception. So we want to claim our individuality, and that's a process of birth and death, and I like to even say rebirth, over and over again. I will even mention that some traditional Christians talk about this process of being born again, and that's not really a term that we use in Unity, but I understand the significance. Traditional Christianity, being born again, is like really coming into your first step of spirituality. But in Unity, we do that all the time. We do it over and over and over again as we continue to claim, our own Christ nature. So here's one more metaphysical interpretation for today, and that's Easter. That's the awakening and rising to spiritual consciousness of the I Am. So as I looked at this today, and I celebrate this whole process of understanding the metaphysics of unity. It's a different way to look at the story. If you've never heard the story this way, I'm just so happy that you're here. It really can be a shift in how you look at things. And I want each of you to realize that just hearing the story is not enough. Unity, there's 5 principles, and one of the principles is we have to live the truth that we know. So what I decided after getting to this part of, we want to claim our I am. So I'm going to start a series probably here in May go into June, and I want to talk about 4 different areas in my own life where I have specifically done a lot of work, and I'm always working and will continue to work. Areas that we can look at on how we can grow the I am. And there's 4 specific areas. We have to grow up. We have to clean up, as in clean up our emotions and our personality and Yeah, I want to leave it at that for now. And then we have to wake up, which is about our spirituality. And then, what's the fourth one? We have to show up in the world in some way. So those are the 4 aspects and 4 ways that we can put all of what I'm talking about into work and grow ourselves in an evolutionary way that we can bring our I am forward into the world. So I hope you'll come back, and I promise I'll give you lots of tips on what to do, and it'll be a lot of fun. So thank you. God bless.